Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back Alan Kasuja.
I have a microphone, so I don't need the podium. Thank you very much for being patient and for being such a brilliant audience. Give yourselves a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Come on, come on, come on. Good. Now, the next gentleman that we're going to have on stage is a very important man. His name is Carlos Lopes. He's from Guinea-Bissau. He's also the Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa. Let's give him a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Come on. Yeah. Please have a seat. Thank you. The last time we met in Abidjan, we had an argument and we disagreed. You thought that I was very pessimistic about where Africa was at the moment. Is that still, is there a cause for optimism?
Well, actually, when we start with pessimism is good.
Good.
Because it demonstrates impatience. Need for transformation requires impatience. It's the energy, it's the driver, it's the incentive for things to change. But if you just keep knocking at every single innovation, every single change that is taking place, then pessimism becomes negativism, which is not what I like.
I like Mr. Lopes because he's very knowledgeable about the continent. He travels all over the continent and he's met pretty much every single president. And he sits in Addis Ababa. And therefore, the key question for me to you is, what is the state of brand Africa? How is Africa doing? What is the health of Africa?
Well, you know, if you look into the specialized publications that deal with economics, they normally are pretty positive about Africa. You know, Ernst & Young, McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, all these big international firms that deal with advisory services, they are very positive about Africa. If you read Financial Times or The Economist, of late, they are very positive about Africa. But let's not be kidding ourselves. That image is not filtering the mainstream media. Therefore, the public opinion continues to see Africa as a place with corruption, with conflicts, with, some progress, economically speaking, but not sustainable. And each time there is a flare somewhere, they immediately go into the negative.
And so, but it's not unreasonable to do that because South Sudan, for no reason whatsoever, flared up, and it caused problems for the whole region. There were problems in Burundi recently that were self-inflicted because of whatever reason. And it's therefore not necessarily untrue that Africa sort of inflicts all these problems on itself.
Yes, the problem is how we measure the various events that you described and many others in relation to the whole. You see, Africa is 1 billion people. There are about 100 million affected by conflict. Nobody talks about the 900. But if you look into Asia, they have about 200 million affected by conflict. Nobody says that Asia is a basket case. In fact, if you think of every single bad news on Africa from a governance point of view, I can give you the equivalent in Asia. You say there is piracy in Africa. Well, the largest piracy concentration in the world is the Strait of Malacca, where you have Singapore, you have Malaysia, yeah. So nobody will associate Singapore or Malaysia with piracy. But
they
have
the Somalis who have moved there.
Yes, they're 10 times more than Somalia or West Africa piracy. If you think about what is happening in South Sudan, it's terrible, it's tragic. But what is happening in Myanmar with the Rohingya is much worse. If you think of conflicts like Burundi, well, let's talk about the possible very detailed description we can make. of constitutional and other problems in Asian
But aren't we
countries.
setting our bar too low when we start comparing ourselves with people who are having conflicts?
Well, it's the mainstream media that does these comparisons in a negative way for Africa.
Okay.
Normally, they speak about the positive somewhere else and the negative about Africa. And this is not just on the governance, it's also on the economics. Because, people keep saying we are the second fastest growing region in the world. How do you define region? For us, it is defined as the continent. But for Asia, it's not defined as a continent. They take away all the big portions that are not good, and then they say Asia is doing better. But what they mean is Southeast Asia, which is a very small, tiny part.
Okay.
If we do the same in Africa, we'll be growing at 10%.
Carlos Lopes, a round of applause. Any questions? Any questions? Prepare your questions. I'm coming back to you in a moment. But let's now talk about what needs to be done to improve things at the moment. What does Africa need to do to prepare itself better and to leverage the opportunities that exist on the continent?
Well, it is very clear that we have been doing very well in terms of economic performance, but we should not take that as a very good investment for the future. What has happened over the last 10, 15 years is basically economic growth based on the same model. We have not structurally modified the way we produce. We have actually less value addition today than we had in 2000. We have less manufacturing value addition today that we had in the beginning of the century. So this is very worrisome. What it means is basically, yes, we get a lot of money from extractive industries and consumption. The consumption is responsible, internal demand, for about 2/3 of our growth, which is a pattern that is unsustainable and is also a pattern that is not transformative. What it means is basically we are reproducing the colonial model of extracting raw, not transforming, not industrializing, and we are heading one characteristic that is very dangerous.
What is that?
Consumption.
Okay. And when we talk about industrialization, there is also a need to, there is all this talk about innovation and how Africa is the bedrock of innovation. But what happens to those great ideas? We don't see them rolling out. We don't see them scaled.
Yes, I think we run the risk. It's a very serious risk. And since this is a theme here in this forum, of basically propelling some examples here and there that are very nice to feel good and think that we are making a dent in terms of the innovation. Innovation is very much associated with productivity gains, and productivity gains are associated with very systemic policies that will allow for the contextual issues to be addressed. Otherwise, you are going to have isolated pockets of innovation.
So that's what we have at the moment.
You are not going to transform societies, and you are not going to have an innovation drive. We are not there yet. Why? Because we need policies, we need institutions, we need regulatory systems. Basically, we need the hard job to be done. Otherwise, we are going to have, like we will have in this panel, David Manku's innovation with his tablet. Fantastic. And I can give you many examples. Some have been mentioned here. The mobile technology advances, the fact that reverse technology is now being present in the healthcare systems, agricultural systems, and so on. But all of those are very isolated. You need the real transformation that comes with the hard job of transforming the economies with good institutions, good policies, and good regulatory
Presumably,
systems.
you're talking about things like intellectual property rights.
That is a fundamental one. I'm glad you mentioned it, because one of the reasons we are not advancing much in terms of our trade is not just because we are producing commodities and products that we don't control the value because we don't control the market prices. No, that is part of the issue. It's also because we are not mastering intellectual property. If you don't master intellectual property, you don't know about rules of origin. If you don't know about rules of origin, you can be mistreated in terms of what you produce. I'll give you one example for the discussion to be very concrete. Last year, for the first time, Ethiopia exported $1 billion of coffee. In fact, the increase in the exports is not coming only by gains by the number of beans that Ethiopia is exporting. It's because Ethiopia has been able to master the value chain, created a commodity exchange internally in the country that determines the prices of those who come to buy, labeled its coffee and branded it with specialties. So now if you go into a Starbucks somewhere in the world, you will see Yergachev coffee or you see Arar coffee. So that gives it much more value. So about 30% of what Ethiopia has been able to increase in value has not come from the beans, has come from mastering intellectual property
So where else is that
and
happening
other
on the
regulatory
continent?
systems.
Is it happening widely?
Well, it is happening like we have been discussing M-Pesa. M-Pesa is an African invention that has now been exported for the first time in a systemic way to Poland. But in fact, it's the first country that is being exposed to this technology in Europe, and eventually it can spread across Europe because Africa right now has about 50% of mobile banking transactions, which is very high, and it was out of necessity. Necessity is the mother of invention, as we say,
Yeah.
and this is very much a
We
good
don't
example
trust
of it.
banks.
But I think we still have isolated cases, not the scale that you were mentioning.
Okay. Any questions? Yes. There's a hand over here. Anybody else with a question?
Yeah, good evening. My name is Sheon Adiabu, Young Stars Foundation, Nigeria. My question is, I have a concern which is about media. Most of the time, media report, magnify a lot of negative stories about Africa. And we need to have
Which media?
media, generally video, picture. For instance, that image is a picture of Broad Street in Lagos, but it's not the current Lagos. That's Lagos of 10 years ago. It has changed now.
Are you saying that Lagos?
That picture is not the current Lagos.
Okay, but
My concern is we need to have a media shift about Africa.
who's responsible?
Reporting
Who's responsible for that?
indigenous media organization in Africa need to be empowered.
How do you do that?
Yeah, they can report what is working in Africa. We need to report more of what is working in Africa, more than the negative. Very, very important.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Would you like to pick up on that?
No, I agree with him. In fact, you know, what really stresses me is the fact that a lot of negativity portrayed about the continent comes from African journalists. You know, it's not that I
But
expect that
I'm an
others-
African journalist.
Yes.
And in our defense,
So you are part
we
of
don't
the-
make up these stories.
You are part of the
We
problem.
don't make up the stories. The stories are about Africa and they are from Africa.
It's the way you present them. It's the way you present them. Most journalists don't do their job of researching and making sure that they have the right information to contextualize what they are reporting that is negative. I don't want, you know, to have media that is only saying nice things and feel-good things. I want real good reporting about the continent. But I really don't like the fact that there is exaggeration and decontextualization when reporting is done. That is the problem.
In conclusion, Carlos, before I call the rest of the panel here, what, on a scale of 1 to 10, is the state of Brand Africa?
Brand Africa has changed tremendously over the last 15 years. We don't talk about Africa the same way as used to, but we are far from where we would like to be. And it is the common responsibility of Africans to change that story. They have to start at home. but they have to do more than just starting at home. They have to be able to actually do an historical perspective of what has happened in other regions of the world so we can have comparators that make sense. And this is what is missing, and this is what institutions like mine are trying to provide information that change the story. We need a new story about Africa, a new narrative. We need better statistics. We need to do the hard work. This is not going to be an easy cop-out. It has to be done with science. It has to be done with determination, but it also requires self-confidence because the continent is the fastest growing continent in the world.
Dr. Carlos Lopes, ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause.